Hello, my friends. It is good to see you, or pretend I'm seeing you, or imagine I'm seeing you. Welcome to my basement lair. It's kind of where my office is, but it's also where I sleep sometimes if I watch too much TV. There's a dehumidifier that goes off down here pretty often. I can't unplug it, so if you see me jumping around, it's because of that. But it turns out the dehumidifier is a little less loud than the baby and the kitties. So that's why I'm down here. This is part one of two videos. This one I'll tell you about in a second, but my second video, which is going to be in a link in the description below or in the email that Wayne sent out, is going to be a little bit more devotional in nature, and it's going to be a little bit shorter and more applicable. I think that this video will be a little bit more academic than my other ones. I'm trying to just transmit some information to you about the book of Philippians. And I'm going to try to do this in a way that we can understand Paul and the Philippian church's situations so that we can identify with them and the things that are similar, and also say, okay, this is different, so how do we read this part of the passage differently? But I think that we're going to find a lot of similarities between Paul's writing to the Philippians and just our situation in general, as we're stuck at home. And I guess I should start off by saying that this letter is, first and foremost, a letter of friendship. It's spurred on by Paul's relationship with the Philippians as one that's friendly. Not every New Testament letter that we have is a friendly letter. If you look at the letter to the Galatians, that's kind of like the opposite of this letter. In Galatians, Paul is always upset and trying to explain himself and trying to retell his theology. In the book of Philippians, he doesn't actually explicitly explain very much theology because him and the Philippians are on good terms and they're on the same page about, what Jesus came to do and what their role in the world is now, stuff like that. So Paul's not going to get in their face and try to reteach them things that he knows they already know. I should say, as we're getting started, that the commentator that I'm using is Gordon Fee, who is the editor of the New International Commentary on the New Testament, which is one of my favorite commentary series, and he wrote the commentary on Philippians, which I'm excited to use. So let's use his thoughts to jump right into the chronology of the letter to the Philippians. And what I mean by chronology is what's going on in Paul's immediate situation that causes him to write this letter, and how does that situation shape what goes into the letter? Some of this is sort of easy to tell because Paul explicitly says it. Some of it we have to infer based off of what we know about the relationship he has with the Philippians and what we know about letter writing in general, both in our own experiences and in the ancient world. There's similarities, but we'll talk about a few differences. So first of all, we have to remember that Paul is in prison. He's socially isolated from everybody that he cares about. And the Philippians seem to know this somehow, probably from a letter from Paul that we don't have. So what they do is they send Epaphroditus. And Epaphroditus gives Paul a gift from the Philippians, probably some money to help him to manage his current affairs. And Epaphroditus also gives Paul some news about his congregation that he needs Paul's help addressing, or the congregation needs Paul's help addressing. So one big difference between how we might experience letter writing and how Paul is experiencing it is that he has somebody there, Timothy, to write the letter for him as he dictates it. People of importance get to do that kind of thing in the ancient world and in our world. To Paul, Timothy is a fellow slave or a fellow servant, as the introduction to the letter goes. So he's a good friend that actually gets to be with Paul in his lockdown situation, where probably Timothy has a little bit more freedom than Paul, who is in chains, as the letter is going to say. So this is the situation that Epaphroditus walks in on. And Epaphroditus, he is a messenger and a friend to Paul from the Philippian church. Epaphroditus brings two things. He brings a monetary gift, assumedly to help Paul manage his affairs from afar. And he also brings Paul news of his church. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that news probably was, but we'll assume that when Paul writes back to the Philippian church, that he is going to be addressing the things that Epaphroditus mentions on his trip. The next part of the chronology is only mentioned a little bit in the book, but it seems like Epaphroditus, while he's visiting or during his travels, falls ill. And it doesn't seem like he's going to make it. And Paul and the Philippians are upset about this until Epaphroditus pulls through and he's able to deliver the response letter from Paul. So here's where we can do a little bit of guesswork about what Epaphroditus has told Paul are the problems in Philippi. Because the introduction to the letter, verses 1 through 11, they basically introduce Paul and Timothy as people, and then Paul introduces what he's going to say throughout the rest of the letter. And the two themes in verses 1 through 11 seem to be disunity within the church and opposition from outside of the church. So Paul is always going to have those three things in mind. He's always going to have his friendship with the Philippians, the opposition that they're facing, and the disunity that they're going through in his mind as he's writing the different parts of his letter. So now let's talk about the actual sections of Paul's letters, now that we know what they're going to relate to. First of all, in verses 12 through 26 of chapter 1, Paul is going to fill the Philippians in on his own situation. Basically, his imprisonment and how that is actually progressing the gospel, which is the goal that Paul always has in his mind, no matter what, even when he's not writing letters. He's trying to advance the gospel. And then in verses 27 through chapter 2, verse 18, Paul is going to start talking or referring to the Philippians' situation, which, because of their disunity, is not advancing the gospel. And Paul wants the gospel to be being advanced everywhere. So talking about his situation, which is advancing it, then their situation and how they can advance it. And then he takes a break. Paul is going to address disunity and opposition more in his letter, but after he talks a little bit about the Philippian disunity situation, he takes a break to fill the Philippians in on his plans currently and in the future. So chapter 2, verses 19 through 30 is basically Paul explaining, hey, before I get into this disunity and opposition thing more, I'm planning on sending Timothy in the future to check on this situation that I'm about to talk about. But in the meantime, here's Epaphroditus, who you miss, who is going to come back with an interim letter. The position of these sections makes sense because from the start of chapter 3 on, Paul is imagining Epaphroditus reading this letter publicly to the Philippians. Everything before this was either an introduction from, hey, this is me, Paul, what's up? Or this is the situation. But now at chapter 3, verse 1 through the end of the letter, Paul is imagining Epaphroditus in front of the Philippians reading this exhortation to address their situation. Kind of cool, in my opinion. I like letter structure, sorry. Something I should mention to my friends who are reading my outline and checking out their Bibles, you might be confused at how it all relates to friendship, disunity, and opposition. A key factor for me to understand how it all relates is realizing that Paul usually uses models as a means of teaching and correcting. Models. So instead of just saying something like, hey, you should be united, you jerks, he says, look at this model of Jesus Christ as your model for humility. And guess how good being humble is going to be for your unity situation. It'll be good. And Paul uses himself as a model too. While he's experienced a lot of opposition, he's still advancing the gospel. So he'll help address their problem by talking about himself as a model. My hope is that we can read all of these sections closely and slowly, but remember that they aren't just some shotgun blast of inspired knowledge that you should be able to pick up and apply easily. We have to also remember what Paul is going through and his goals for the Philippians as we read this book slowly. So now is a good time to end this video and point you towards the next video, which will be a little bit more focused on applying Paul's letter, specifically the first half of the first verse of his letter, which I think should be some fun. Good talking to you guys if this is where you end.